Hi, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Gary Zacharias, and this is Apologist Bookshelf. I'm taking a second look at Phil Yancey's book called Where is God When It Hurts? The last I saw it sold close to 1 million copies, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. And I've got an older copy. Let's see, when mine was 1990, my paperback copy. So it's been out for quite a while. A Gold Medallion Book Award that it received tells you something about it. I like a lot of the things that Yancey puts out very much. He's common sense, ordinary Christian struggling with things that we all think about. He doesn't pretend everything is smooth and polished as far as Christianity goes, but he comes down strongly for Christianity compared to other religions, for example. So this book, Where's God When It Hurts?, talks about just struggling with the whole idea of pain and evil that we all come up against. We've all come through COVID, and if you're like me, you've lost people that you knew very well, and it was heartbreaking. But I'm going to take a look at his chapter 6. I did chapter 5 last time, which was called The Groaning Planet. And this one is, what is God trying to tell us? I mean, this whole issue of pain and suffering has always been the thing that people throw in the face of Christians. Of course, what I find interesting is that, sure, it is a struggle for us to deal with it, but what about other worldviews? They're not free of having to struggle with it. What's their answer? And I think Christianity comes out much stronger than any other worldview does. Anyway, so let's start in chapter 6. John Donne is quoted at the beginning here from his book, Devotions. This is what John Donne said, the famous English poet back in the 1600s. I can read my affliction as a correction or as a mercy, and I confess I know not how to read it. How should I understand this illness? I cannot conclude, though death conclude me. If it is a correction indeed, let me translate it and read it as a mercy. For though it may appear to be a correction, I can have no greater proof of your mercy than to die in thee, and by that death to be united to him who died for me. Yancey starts his chapter in a powerful way. He has a Time magazine report that he focuses on that came from Yuba City, California, and it talks about these people in this one cemetery that are just crushed. They've lost their sons, they've lost daughters. It talks about people breaking down in tears. And it said 15,000 citizens came out. There was a bus bearing 53 members of a local high school choir and a chaperone. It had ripped through 72 feet of guardrail as it had turned onto an exit ramp. The bus ended up plunging 21 feet to the ground, landing on its top, and the roof was crushed down to the seats. And somebody said, I heard, oh my God. One survivor saying she heard, oh my God, from the front of the bus. The tenor and one of the choir members said everything was a tangle of weeping and moaning and scattered arms and legs. The final total, 29 dead and 25 injured. How grim is that? Somebody said, president of the student body, this is the first time that most of us have ever had close friends die. Well, isn't that powerful? I mean, we see that, we're just shocked and we're horrified. And he said, that was a traffic accident, more fatalities than most, obviously. But it said nothing like devastation of California earthquakes or floods in Pakistan or ferry boat accidents, wreckage all over the place, all over the world. And the question, of course, is why did these 29 kids deserve a grisly mass highway death? Says you couldn't avoid those questions. If you survived, and some of them did, the rest of your life, you'd wonder, why did you live when so many friends died? Yeah, let me throw something in here, by the way. When I hear, let's say, a plane crash where some people died, and a survivor will say, well, God led me out of the plane, or God allowed me to live, then it does bring up that question. Well, okay, God allowed you to live, but what about the people that died? Did they commit some kind of heinous sin that God took them? Was it just arbitrariness on God's part? I mean, those are hard questions. And so here's what Yancey says. Does God reach down and slightly twist the wheels of the school bus and watch it go over an edge of a cliff? Does he draw a red pencil line through a map of Indiana to plot a path of a tornado? There, hit that house. Kill that 6-year-old, but skip over this one next to it. Does God program the earth like a video game, constantly experimenting with tidal waves, seismic tremblers, and hurricanes? Is this how he rewards and punishes us, his helpless victims? He said, boy, that sounds sacrilegious to say it, but again, the honesty of Yancey is so good. He said, they've long haunted me. And he says, and various forms have been tossed at me like spears by agnostic friends. Yes, exactly. That's what we hear from people who are not Christians. That's their first defense. Well, you believe in a good God, huh? Well, then how do you explain this evil and that evil? So he said, it's a part of human experience to wonder about suffering. He has a book, he says, this is Yancey again, he has a book on his shelf called Theories of Illness that looked at 139 tribal groups around the world, and all but 4 of them understood illness to be a sign of God disapproving of them. That's interesting. He said, pain does have value to protect human bodies. He has a chapter on that. Everybody grants that. And he says suffering does have some probably moral value to show us that we're mortal. And Christians, he said, will take that one step further, that God is speaking to the human race, kind of like in a megaphone of pain, it gets our attention. But he said pain never comes to us in general, it comes specific. He said he once watched a TV show with a famous Hollywood actress. Her lover had drowned in a harbor near L.A., and the police investigated, found out that he rolled off a yacht while he was drunk. The actress looked at the camera and asked, how could a loving God let this happen? Said that actress probably hadn't thought about God for a long time, but all of a sudden she was facing suffering, and she lashed out in anger. And it said for a lot of us, doubt follows pain quickly, like a reflex action. Suffering calls our basic beliefs about God into question. Yancey says when it strikes, I just can't help wondering, what is God trying to tell me by this strep throat or by my friend's death? Does he have a message for me? So faith in God, he says, gives us no insurance against tragedy. So he said he wanted to think about the cause. If God is in charge, somehow connected to all the world's suffering, why is he seeming to be so capricious, so unfair? He said, if you look through the Bible to get an answer to the question, who did it, right? What's going on here? You'll come away with mixed answers. So he said, take a look. He starts in Genesis 38. God is portrayed as the direct cause of Er's suffering. That's 38, verse 7. He was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then you look in Luke 13, verses 10 to 16. Satan, or at least a spirit, was the direct cause of a woman's infirmity, crippled her for 18 years. Job 2, verses 4 to 7. Job has all of these pains that are inflicted by Satan, but only after God said, yes, you can go ahead. How about Proverbs 26, verse 27? It says, very typical of Proverbs, it stresses natural consequences of your actions. If you follow an evil pattern, you're going to suffer. And so he said, I have yet to find in the Bible any grand unifying theory of causation. Now, that's quite a statement. In other words, he can't put together a statement that says, yes, this is what God's up to and this is what God is doing. He said, if you look at, especially at the Old Testament, God intervenes supernaturally and he punishes evil. And he said, I can't propose a grand unifying theory, but Yancey says, I could offer 2 observations. Okay, so number 1, he says, many of these Old Testament passages warn against painful consequences that are going to follow specific actions. He says one scholar showed that Psalms, Proverbs, and most of the other Old Testament books have this idea that wrong choices lead to painful consequences. Proverbs has a lot of that. How about Proverbs 19:15? Laziness brings on deep sleep, and the shiftless man goes hungry. So a lot of these verses, a lot of these passages show that God set up humans and our society to operate according to certain principles. So honesty and truthfulness and compassion, that'll give you good results for the most part. Whereas cheating and lying and greed are going to give you just the opposite. So that's the first observation that he has about, especially in the Old Testament. Here's number 2. Some Old Testament passages show God causing human suffering as punishment for wrong behavior. So says, you look at the prophetic books, there are all sorts of dire warnings of judgment, but it said usually there were lots of forewarnings before that. Amos and Jeremiah and Isaiah and Habakkuk and Hosea and Ezekiel all put out a list that says, if you do these following things, you're going to get punished. In almost every case, too, the prophets also hold out that God will restrain himself. There's a hope if Israel would repent. But if she continues in rebellion, she's going to get crushed. So the judgment is coming from God, but it's not capricious. It's not unjust. It's not spur of the moment. It's not, oh, I think maybe I'll do this. Old Testament punishment, Yancey is saying, was consistent with God's covenant or contract with Israel and came after warning after warning after warning. And he says, so he said, you look in the Old Testament, there's a lot of things that basically say do good, you get rewarded, do bad, you get punished. But he said, I don't think the principle applies in precisely the same way today. He had an earlier book, I'm talking about Yancey, he had an earlier book called Disappointment with God. And he argued that God's rules, as far as his contract with Israel, that was a unique relationship, and we shouldn't expect that to be the same thing today. So he said, suffering people just get all tormented with all these questions. And he said, biblical examples do offer some guidance. He said, yes, certain actions may lead to painful consequences. That's still around today. If you ski in a real crazy way toward avalanche country or something, or you're going too fast, you're in danger. If you start speeding on a rain-slick highway, watch out. You're going to hydroplane. If you eat fried food and Twinkies all day, what do? You're getting yourself set up for health risks. He says the book of Proverbs goes further than these simple examples. He says, in there you see our actions have a moral dimension that could affect our health and comfort on earth. So today we've got like the promiscuous sex and smoking and doing drugs. That all has direct and painful consequences. We understand that. He said Christians and non-Christians are going to fall under this category of, you do bad things will happen probably to you. He says, what about the second principle? That sometimes God intervenes directly to punish people for wrong behavior, right? So the first principle is that in general, if you do certain behaviors, things will happen to you. But now, what about coming to an individual person and giving that person a problem? He says, but there's a difference between the suffering that most of us encounter, like skiing injury or cancer or bus accident. There's a difference between that and the suffering as punishment described in the Old Testament. There, if you read it carefully, punishment would follow warnings after warnings about specific behavior. In fact, to be effective there, punishment required a clear tie to behavior. Now, people of Israel knew why they're being punished. The prophets had warned them. They warned them over and over again. Now, does that pattern resemble what happens to most of us today? Do we get a direct revelation from God warning us of a coming catastrophe? Do we have a prophet that comes and speaks to us? He says, does personal suffering come packaged with a clear explanation from God? He said, well, if not, I have to question whether the pains that most of us feel are indeed punishments from God. I think that's a good point. They said, we've got stories in the Bible about people who suffered and definitely were not being punished by God. So he moves to another section here in this chapter about what Jesus says. He said, Christians, of course, believe that with the coming of Jesus, God entered human history. He's not just out there somewhere. Now he's coming in a form of a human being. And so he said the best clue we have to understand how God feels about human pain is to see how Jesus responded. So what does he notice as he goes through the New Testament stories of Jesus? Well, Yancey says Jesus never gave a poor or a suffering person some kind of speech about, accept your lot in life or take the medicine that God has given you. He seemed really sensitive to the groans of suffering people and did try to remedy them. He used his supernatural powers to heal, not to punish. He says, of course, miracles of healing were great crowd pleasers, but even Jesus refused to make them the centerpiece of what he was doing. He used physical healings as a sign of a deeper truth. It was almost like his calling card. So was Jesus telling us that it's not good for God to intervene in our world on a day-to-day basis? The important thing, the kingdom of heaven, isn't that a kingdom of the Spirit inside of us, not an external spectacular display of God's power? Well, at the least, Jesus declined to make radical changes in the natural laws that govern our planet. And when he faced suffering, he reacted like we do, with fear and dread. So how did he deal with that particular question? Who is responsible for suffering? He said, take a look at Luke 13. So he's asked about some current events in that chapter. He's asked about two current events that have prompted a lot of local discussion. One was political oppression. Romans apparently had slaughtered some members of a religious minority. Another one, there's a construction accident that killed 18 people. And so he said that's kind of the equivalent of that bus, modern day story about that bus that went off the rails and crashed and killed some kids. It says Jesus' response was enigmatic, but it was brilliant. He doesn't really answer the question of cause. He never says, well, here's why these two tragedies occurred. But Jesus made one thing clear. They did not occur as a result of specific wrongdoing. And here's the quote. Jesus says this, do you think these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered this way? I tell you, no. Are those 18 who died when the Tower of Siloam fell on them, do you think they were more guilty than all the others living in Jerusalem? I tell you, no. Jesus makes plain there, doesn't he, that the victims had done nothing unusual to deserve their fates. They were like all of us. Maybe the tower just fell because it was built poorly. He says, I think Jesus would have replied similarly to that bus accident. Do you think they were worse sinners? He said, maybe the bus crashed because of driver error, mechanical failure. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He uses those tragedies to point to some eternal truths. Unless you repent, you too will all perish. And then he follows with a parable about God's restraining mercy. So what does Jesus imply? That we bystanders have as much to learn about the event as do the victims. A tragedy should alert us to make ourselves ready in case we're the next victim of a falling tower or an act of political terrorism. Yancey ends his chapter by saying he once attended a funeral service for a teenage girl killed in a car accident. Oh, how horrific. Her mother wailed, the Lord took her home. He must have had some purpose. Thank you, Lord. He said he's been with sick Christian people who agonize over the question, what is God trying to teach me? Or maybe they plead, how can I find enough faith to get rid of this illness? How can I get God to rescue me? Yancey says maybe people have it all wrong. Maybe God isn't trying to tell us anything specific each time we hurt. Pain and suffering are part and parcel of our planet, and we as Christians are not going to be exempt. And many times we do know why we got sick. We didn't exercise enough, bad diet, got a germ. Do we expect God to go around protecting us whenever we encounter something dangerous? So Yancey says the approach Jesus takes corresponds exactly to what he suggested about pain being a megaphone of God. Suffering offers a general message of warning, doesn't it, to all of us that something is wrong with this planet. We need some outside intervention, something radical. But you can't argue backward and link someone's specific pain to a direct act of God. Now, I like what he ends here. This is the best story, I think, in the Bible that deals with pain and suffering. In John 9, his followers, Jesus is out with his followers, and they point to a man there on the side there, born blind. And they said, who sinned, this man or his parents? In other words, they had it all figured out. If he's blind, he had to have done something to cause the blindness, cause and effect. He did some sin, so God struck him down. But what does Jesus say? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. See, the disciples wanted to look backward to figure out, why did this happen? Jesus redirects their attention. He points forward. He asks a different question, to what end? And he said, I think that offers a neat summary of the Bible's approach to the problem of pain. If we look back to see why, the Bible doesn't really give definite answers, but it holds out our hope for the future, that even suffering can be transformed or redeemed. A tragedy like blindness could be used to display God's work. So that's how he ends this chapter. And I've done an extensive talk on pain and suffering. You can go to my website if you want, apologeticsforlife.org, and you'll find a video recording of that as well as an audio recording. And I hope you I hope you wrestle with this. Not that we're going to come up with a conclusion about pain and suffering, but we need to think about it. Not only has Phil Yancey done a lot of good work with this, but Tim Keller has a wonderful book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. And so a lot of people have struggled with this, and we need to at least think about it ahead of time. Sometimes if we are in the middle of pain and suffering, it's hard to be clear. It's hard to have our foundational thoughts all prepared. So if we think about it ahead of time, it's not a case of if we have pain and suffering. We all will. And we need to kind of think about our response ahead of time. Well, anyway, thank you so much for being with me for this podcast. Yancey is a good author. I think somebody that you would get a lot out of. Like I said, he seems like an ordinary guy struggling with these issues like we all do. All right, well, I hope you have a good rest of your day.